Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Quinn Nelson, who is Senior Account Analyst, Client Services at enVista. And today we're going to talk about leading practices for running proactive analytics. Now, companies today have, more data than ever before, and that's certainly true when it comes to, transportation management. And transforming that data into actions that deliver business value is the main goal. And that's where proactive analytics come in. But what exactly are proactive analytics? And how can you leverage them to deliver business value, and how are they different than traditional analytics? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to kind of dive into in today's episode. And it's great to have Quinn on the program to kind of share his insights and perspective and advice on this topic. So Quinn, welcome to the program.
Great. Thank you for having me.
So Quinn, we've had many of your colleagues there at enVista on Talking Logistics before. This is your first time. So like I always like to do whenever we bring on a new guest to the program, just want to find out a little bit about them, how and why they got involved in this industry to begin with. So why don't we start there? Briefly tell us a little bit about, your career path and then what your current role and responsibilities are there at enVista.
Sure. All right. First of all, thank you very much. Definitely appreciate the time today. As you said, my name is Quinn Nelson. I am a Senior Account Analyst with enVista. I've been with enVista for 4 years now. I initially attended Ball State University in Indiana and graduated there with a degree in logistics and supply chain management. So that's kind of the main logistics background that I had. Been with enVista since 2015, and I've been primarily in an analyst or an account analyst type of role, regardless, always working with data. My current role as an account analyst is mainly to become an expert on our clients' data and use proactive analytics quite heavily. So we're there to proactively analyze client data, to make actionable call outs and impactful kind of things that clients can look into, and then also to monitor industry news in general.
Yeah, that's great. I interview a lot of people on this program over the past few years that we've been doing Talking Logistics, and a lot of folks that I would say are on the older side, if you will. They all had backgrounds, maybe like myself, who came out of engineering, or came out of manufacturing, or came out of somewhere else, and get started, and then kind of some way somehow ended up in supply chain logistics. And I think as we, I think you're a little bit younger than I am, so I think as we're seeing kind of the next generation, if you will, of folks, I think it's encouraging to see folks that actually studied logistics at the university level and come in with that academic background and now start applying that into this realm. So, kind of great. I'm seeing more and more of that, which I think is great, validation, if you will, that the academic world is, beginning to recognize, that this is a degree area and a focus area that, more students should be folks get in. Now I just have to convince my own kids to get into the industry, but we'll see if that works. But let's go into the topic now. So let's start with just a basic question. I mean, what are proactive analytics, and how are they different from traditional analytics, or what you kind of see and read about these days?
Sure. So proactive analytics focus mainly on analyzing data in as close to real time as possible in order to uncover troubling trends before they become a major issue. Most conventional data analytics focus on analyzing large historical data sets. So you're typically looking at the past 6 months, the past year, year over year. And within those, you're typically looking to uncover trends, potential cost savings, or areas of concern that you may see. Although those retrospective analytics are very informative, ultimately they can't undo the past. An anecdote that I like to use is realizing in January that you had 50,000 1-pound peak season packages all get dimensionally billed by the carrier at 15 pounds is not going to get you your money back. So proactive analytics allows you to analyze data in as close to real time as possible to catch those issues before they have a major impact on your bottom line. But the key is really knowing how to most effectively use data so as not to miss avoidable problems, and also not to raise unnecessary red flags as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's something that I hear a lot from shippers and even logistics service for everyone, right? This idea of being more proactive in everything they do, because to your point, if you're there's a value to seeing what happened in the past, but what's happened has happened, right? And you can't undo it. So really trying to understand what's happening here and now, and taking those corrective actions before they become bigger problems, I think is the name of the game, or the main objective that a lot of companies have. So let's talk now about, how you set this up, right? And how you get started with all this. I mean, what are some, based on your experience and working with clients, I mean, what are some leading practices in setting up and actually using proactive analytics?
Sure. So in an ideal scenario, you'd have access to a full reporting suite that contains both carrier invoice data and planned shipment detail data extracted from one of your internal systems. Those planned shipment details are going to help to fill any gaps for shipments that have not yet been invoiced by the carrier. And they're also going to give you the most robust user experience and allow you to run the best proactive analytics that you can. However, even if you only have access to carrier invoice data, you can still definitely run some excellent proactive analytics. But when running proactive analytics, proper setup is key. Improper setup has two major fallout potentials. The first is that important callouts can go unnoticed, and the second is that you can raise false alarms, which are just going to be a waste of time and resources on the client side. So when running proactive analytics, I found that there are 4 keys to successfully setting up and running your analysis. Those 4 keys, which I'll go into detail on each of them, are picking the correct date criteria, using carriers with consistent billing cycles when you're doing your analysis, using the correct metrics, and making actionable callouts. So the first one is picking your correct date criteria. We've all run those retrospective reports based on paid invoice data. It's usually as simple as determining your date range and just kind of diving in. You're far enough downstream that it doesn't really matter how you set up your criteria as long as you know what date range you're working with. But proactive analytics are definitely trickier. You're oftentimes working with incomplete or fluid data sets, and by incomplete, I mean that carriers have not invoiced all the shipments yet, and you're running data as soon as it's invoiced by the carrier. So therefore, we always want to run proactive analytics based on invoice date. There's a natural delay between when carriers ship a package and when it's actually invoiced. And if you pull all the shipments for a given ship date range before they've all been invoiced, you really run the risk of missing data and working with data sets that are going to change week over week. So take this, for example. If you ran today a data set for last week based on ship date, and then you ran that exact same report next week, your data set's going to have gotten bigger as the carrier invoices more shipments. So assuming that invoices are loaded to the reporting system that you're using fairly quickly after they're received from the carrier, data sets generated by invoice date will be roughly the same whether they're run today or in the future. My second point is it's easiest to work with carriers that have consistent billing cycles. This kind of goes hand in hand with my first point around invoice date. Those best proactive analytics are going to come from the carriers that are invoicing on kind of a common schedule. Typically once per week is the best. The good news is that most carriers, including many of the large parcel carriers, do adhere to this type of a billing schedule. The goal with any type of analytics is to compare similar data sets to each other, whether you're looking year over year, month over month, or in the case of proactive analytics, even week over week. As you're going to be running these proactive analytics based on invoice date, you're kind of at the mercy of what a carrier invoices during a given time. So since you're looking by invoice date, your data set is reflective of not what you shipped during that period, but rather what the carrier got billed during that period. So carriers with consistent billing cycles are best because if a carrier bills once per week, even if it's different ship dates within that data set, each week's set of invoices are going to contain a roughly similar mix of account numbers, the delay between the ship date and the invoice date, the shipment mix, etc. Therefore, although those ship dates are random, you're still comparing a fairly similar data set week over week. So for example, if you get one invoice for your DC outbound account, one invoice for your vendor dropship account, and one invoice for your supplier inbound account this week, chances are you're going to receive an invoice for each of those accounts next week as well. So you'll be comparing kind of apples to apples. My third point is making sure you use the correct metrics in your analysis. As we already discussed, we're running based on invoice date. Therefore, your data set is not based on what was shipped during that period. It was what was invoiced by the carrier during that period. Therefore, we want to stay away from the total metrics. So total metrics would include things like total spend, total number of shipments, total accessorial spend, total weight, things like that. These total metrics are only going to show you the total amount or the total spend or the total packages that the carrier invoiced during that time period, not what your business actually did. So instead, relational metrics such as cost per package, cost per pound, things like that, those are excellent places to start. But the real insight can be gained from percent metrics. And by percent metrics, I mean things like percent of total spend made up by accessorial charges, percent of packages where dimensional weighting was applied, the percent difference between your average bill weight and average actual weights, the percent of packages affected by a certain charge type, percent of packages shipped to a certain zone, things like that. So these metrics are really good at comparing similar but not exact data sets. So consider this, for example, the carrier this week may have invoiced a very high amount of accessorial charges, but if you look at the percent of your total spend that these accessorials account for, it could be the same as last week and not worth raising that red flag. My fourth point is to make actionable callouts. So with any shipment, there's four main factors that are going to influence the cost of that shipment: the service level commitment, the distance the package travels or the zone, the package weights and dimensions, and any surcharges or accessorials. So trends or changes that you may see in your data are going to be driven by two things. Either you changed something about your shipping behavior or the carrier made a change in their billing standards. As we mentioned earlier, high-level metrics such as cost per pound and cost per package are great places to start. And in fact, every negative trend that you see in your data is probably going to be reflected in one of those three metrics. So cost per pound, cost per package, weight per package, they're good places to start, but they don't make good callouts. A good callout consists of three main factors. First of all, what is the problem? Next, what is the cost impact or potential cost impact of the problem? And finally, and most importantly, what specifically can you change to eliminate the problem? If I came to you and said cost per package is rising, what exactly would you change? Who knows? It's fairly ambiguous. But data is like an onion. You need to peel back those layers. Cost per package is increasing. Okay, great. Let's ask some follow-up questions to that. Is this service level related? Is it zone or distance related? Is it accessorial related? Are there specific account numbers that are driving the increase? Are there specific inbound or outbound locations driving the increase? Is there a specific carrier driving the increase? Using high-level metrics are a great launching pad for things, but ultimately you really need to keep digging in order to produce those actionable callouts that you can drive change based on.
You know, Quinn, those are, you know, those four pillars, I think, are a great framework for companies to think about in terms of how they get started with this or lay that foundation to move forward with proactive analytics. I mean, I like the, the difference between, the shipments, right, and invoices, or when things got shipped versus when they got invoiced. And I think, most folks would, I think I would, if I was in that role, I would, kind of my inclination would be to look at shipments, right, versus what was invoiced. But as you kind of very eloquently put it, you can see the differences in terms of, what impact it would have just by changing that view or that perspective, and why it's important to really have the right filter, if you will, the right starting point, to really start making these, comparisons. And then I think the other key point is the metrics. I think that's an area that no matter what you're doing in, whether it's a technology investment or something like this, you ultimately have to have the right metrics to make sure that you're trying to accomplish what you want to accomplish and you're heading in the right direction. And I think a lot of times, folks might be, fall into just using the same old metrics, if you will, or the basic ones that they are accustomed to. But sometimes in something like this, it's really, really taking a step back and asking, do we have the right metrics and which ones make the most sense? To your points, in this type of, initiative where you're really trying to then create some action to drive more real-time results, if you will. So I think those are all great points. I mean, there must be technology, obviously, that plays a role here. I mean, and people, obviously, too. So, I mean, what are what's required from a technology and a people standpoint to make proactive analytics, work and then ultimately get the most out of them?
Sure. So first and foremost, you need data. Without data, proactive analytics are not going to be a reality. The ideal scenario, which I'll go into, is usually working with some sort of a third-party audit and pay provider, such as enVista. With those type of companies, what you're going to get is visibility to all of your data for all your carriers across all modes. Real-time invoice upload from the carrier. It'll also afford you the opportunity to consider those planned shipments in addition to your carrier invoice data if you have the internal capability to provide that to your provider. Having that plan detail is going to allow for even faster identification of issues. It's going to help to fill the gap between when you ship the package and when it gets invoiced. And it can also open doors for additional reporting, such as accruals. So that's kind of a benefit of working with a third-party auditor. In addition, those companies like enVista are going to provide you with a robust reporting engine and a lot of times a BI platform as well. BI platforms are fantastic for proactive analytics. They're going to give you real-time data visibility in easy-to-read dashboards with a lot of times they have drill-in functionality as well. So when you're trying to take those high-level callouts and turn them into actionable callouts, being able to drill into the data is crucial. I think a big call out is that manual analytics using Excel and Access, they take a long time to put together, but having a dashboard for each key metric like average weight, average zone, etc., that's going to really allow you to see those trends week over week. And lastly, kind of working with a third-party provider is going to give you that expert analyst assistance. So even just at my time in enVista, I've done stuff with financial and payment reporting, automated GL coding, order match using that planned invoice data, round trip integration back to an ERP system. So just kind of working with people who know carrier data and how carrier data works backwards and forwards. You can also definitely get data from an internal source, such as your AP department or maybe an ERP system, but that definitely runs the risk of not having enough detail. The key considerations around whatever data source you're using, whether it's internal or external, is that it must be detailed enough. And that's a major pitfall that we see, especially if you're extracting from an ERP system. Kind of that total spend by carrier is not enough. You're going to need shipment level detail that for each shipment shows the carrier, the service it used, the weight, the zone, the accessorial breakout and details, the account number, the shipper and receiver info, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, when you talked about, the four pillars and like I mentioned in my opening comments, I mean, we're dealing with so much data these days. And obviously, like you said, you really need those details to get the most out of this. A lot of folks are still trying to do these with the Excel spreadsheets and creating these macros and these, mega spreadsheets. And, it's just getting more and more complex to do that. And the reality is that you're really, you're still not going to be able to do what some of these newer technologies and capabilities now afford folks to do. And so I think, leveraging that technology is important. I think from a people aspect, you hear a lot these days about companies hiring data scientists because, it's one thing to be able to gather the information and use these technologies to be able to present and make those connections, if you will. But then ultimately it takes folks that, know the business, have that, know the processes, and can, make business sense out of what they're, seeing out of the data. So the people aspect, I think, is, critically important too. And certainly that's an area that, partners can bring to the table, is that, the human expertise as well as the technology. Another basic question. I mean, ultimately, why invest in proactive analytics? I mean, what are the benefits? What are some of the things your customers are benefiting from by using this?
Sure. The key is really having that real-time visibility. The ability to spot problems before they become a major issue is just massive. So if you can address an issue with only a week or two of negative impact, as opposed to a quarter or even a year of negative impact, that's huge. The ability to create those actionable callouts that can be appropriately addressed by your organization in a very targeted manner is only going to create positive change.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I did a bike ride last November, and I was a century, 100 miles, and my buddy and I, we ended up going off course for 3 miles. So, when you're doing a 100-mile bike ride, and this is like miles 70 something already, right? Going off 3 miles is pretty significantly. It would have been good to know within a few hundred yards or feet that we were heading in the wrong direction and getting back on course. And I think it's the same thing. I mean, it's a silly analogy, but it's the same type of thing here, right? I mean, I think especially when you're talking about dollars, right? It's one thing if you're off course for a week or two or three. It's another thing if you've been off course for a whole month or a whole quarter, and that impact is much more significantly. So Quinn, we're kind of running out of time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. As a way to wrap up, I mean, what's the first step that companies should take to get started?
Yeah, that first step is always going to be find your data source. Without that strong and consistent data source, none of this is going to be possible. It doesn't matter if you have the correct metrics or looking at the right things. If you don't have data, it's not going to be a reality. Ideally, working with a third-party audit and pay firm such as enVista will give you the most robust analytics possible. But even if you rely on an internal data source, that detailed data is still going to be key.
Excellent. Well, Quinn, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we managed to scratch the surface on these topics, but we definitely covered a lot of ground. You provided some great, advice and recommendations for how to get started with this. I know we recently published a guest commentary by you that kind of touched upon this topic as well. So, you can go and visit, talkinglogistics.com and find that guest commentary. Great resource in addition to our conversation today. But again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Great. Thank you so much.
I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the enVista website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Quinn, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.